This is a little video about chemo. A lot of people equate cancer with chemo, but in fact there are a lot of cancers that do not require chemo. So for example, you can get sunspots and they might develop into, eventually, because they tend to be quite slow growing, they might develop into what's called squamous cell carcinoma, a little skin cancer that spreads across the surface of the skin. And so it can cause, a lot of damage to your skin, but it takes a long time of not treating that before that's going to, become life-threatening. People might get that on the inside of their body. You can get it on the inside of your mouth, and it can eventually, just spread and you wouldn't even know. And that's when it can be a problem, and it can eventually get into the lymph system, and you might have lymphoma that started as a squamous cell carcinoma that was inside the throat or the mouth or the organs, because we can get those little skin cancers, that are not just on the outside. Basal cell skin cancers. These are like little volcanoes. They look like a pimple, but it's a pimple that doesn't go away, and then it starts bleeding. It looks like a crater, and it's quite small on the top, like the end of a pencil, but underneath it's like a little volcano, like closer to the end of your finger. But basal cell carcinoma tends to just eat that area. It can disfigure you. It might be on an arm, might be on a back, might be, on your face. But with, they cut it out and they check all the margins, which is the space around what they cut out, and they make sure that they've got all the cancerous change stuff, and then they stitch it back together. And you're looking at my face, and this is where I had a basal cell carcinoma cut out. You can see one nostril is a bit smaller than the other one. When I first had it done, of course, I was all black and blue, and yes, my God, I had a cancer, but it wasn't going to threaten my life, and it was just going to disfigure me further if I didn't get it cut out. So it can go into the nerves, it can make you lose your smile, your facial, all kinds of things. So it's good to jump on these things and get them cut out. Things like what's called in situ cancer and or precancerous changes. So I had cervical cancer or precancerous changes in my cervix when I was in my 20s, and it progressed to being in situ, which means that instead of just what's called dysplasia, where cells are changing and becoming cancerous, it had become cancerous, but only in situ, in its own little position, nicely contained. And so I had laser. They burned those cells away, and that was that. And I didn't have recurrence. And you can have, so that's just some examples of cancers that that don't necessarily require chemo, but there are people who might have cervical cancer and it's spread further, and that's when it's no longer in situ, and it becomes what's called, in situ is stage 1, and then beyond that is invasive, and that might be stage 2, and when that becomes over a certain size or a certain spread, that can become stage, depending on your staging, stage 2B, stage 3. And at that point, it might make vein systems and go and, find ways to feed itself. And that's when you're getting in trouble. Because in those vein systems, of course, it kind of can let little cells off into the bloodstream, and those can float around and decide to make tumours in other parts of the body, which is called metastases. So that's more advanced cancer, and that's the kind of thing where you would need chemo. So a cancer that's left untreated can, or isn't found, may also get into the lymph system. It may travel through the lymph and affect the lymph nodes, and then those might make changes and turn cancerous, and that's a lymphoma situation. But if that's come from a certain part of your body, even if it's gone into the lymph nodes, like if you had it in a breast and it was in situ and then it became invasive and it formed a tumour, the tumour made root systems and sent its little cells through lymph and blood, even if it turned a lymph node cancerous, it's still breast cancer because that's the type of cells. So when does a cancer require, and you might have a lump and it's small and it hasn't gone into the lymph system and it hasn't made extensive vein systems, and so they might just say, nope, we'll cut that out, we'll cut that tumor out, and then we'll radiate that area, use radiation to make sure that any new cancer cells are not going to just start up in the same area and keep you safer. And you may say, well, don't I need chemo? And they will say no. And you go, are you sure? And, you might go, yay, I don't need it. And that's because under a certain size with none of these signs of spread, it's localized. And so they can cut this out, treat that area, and hopefully you're done and dusted. If it's gone into your lymph nodes, or it's made vein systems where it's obvious it's gone off into your bloodstream, or if a lump is over a certain size, then they know that little cells break off and the chances are it's gone for a little wander. And now those little tiny cells, they're smaller than the head of a pin. You can't even see them. So it's not like, oh, stick me in a scanner, we need to see how many stray cells got out. You can't see them. They have to grow to a certain size to be able to be found on a scan. They have to have become tumours, not just little stray cells. So when they do chemo in a primary cancer patient, they're trying to just kill those little, things that are smaller than the head of a pin. And before they start to multiply, before they turn themselves into tumours, before they create root systems to feed themselves off you. And so what happens in primary cancer, and I had a primary breast cancer in 2011. When I first felt the lump for this, it was about the size of an almond. And I had cysts, but I thought, oh, it's another cyst, and it was, sore, and it was growing fast. I thought, this is a bit strange. My cysts have not grown like this. So I waited a few weeks. I didn't wait very long, and went to see the GP, and he said, oh, look, it moves around, so it's probably not cancer, because cancer won't move around. He sent me for a mammogram, and it was cancer. I got a biopsy. They went in, plucked some out. Yep, it's cancer. In fact, I had two, and the other one was a cyst, and that one was cancer. So then I saw the breast surgeon, and she said, oh, well, it's under 3 centimeters. I think it was 2.3 centimeters. And, you can have a tumor that is invasive cancer in a part of your body, and it might be like a 1 centimeter or a half a centimeter. This is called, that's like stage 1. It's very small. And when something is like, 2.5 centimeters, it's, it's a bit more challenging, and but it's still the kind of thing they say, no, we'll just cut this out and we'll radiate the area. And that was the plan. I decided when I saw the path report that I could see that this was multifocal, many different little areas had come together to make this tumour. So I knew that it was very likely this was coming back. It was a type of cells that had up to 50% chance of coming to the same breast and 40% to the other breast. So I said, I am not going to do radiation. I want these breasts cut off, and then there's nothing left to radiate. So because I don't need chemo, because it's still under 3 centimeters, my tumor, let's just cut my breasts off and let me out of here. And they did do that. But when I came back, in the time between that decision and having the surgery was not very long. I think it was 2 weeks, and in 2 weeks it had become a 3 centimeter tumour with vein systems feeding itself and a reactive lymph node. So the lymph node hadn't become cancerous, but I understand it was reacting to cancer, so cells were travelling through there. So next thing I was told, I was going to be a chemo girl. So chemo in primary cancer, people say, oh, well, you get these really, they look healthy and they're vibrant and they're not, big and bloated and unable to function with severe chemo brain like those other chemo patients. So why are they doing it so well? And this assumption that everyone who's doing chemo is doing it so hard and blah, blah. And my chemo for primary, I was really, really sick. I was incredibly bloated with like edema all through my legs and my arms and my neck and my face. I looked like the Michelin Man. My color was really bad. I had severe autonomic dysfunction. Couldn't control my everything, my temperature, my breathing, the bladder thing, the bowel thing. Every department of autonomics was really not working very well. I was in big trouble. Really bad chemo brain. But I only had to do that chemo once every 3 weeks, but it was incredibly hard hitting. They hit you with enough to kill all those tiny little head of a pin, or less than a head of a pin, little stray cells, and they want to kill as many of those as possible so that later you don't come back with stage 4 that's settled into your bones or your liver or your brain or your lungs and has made little vein systems to feed itself. So they're hoping to kill all that off, because that's when it's easy to kill off. And they know they won't kill all of it, but especially if you have hormone receptive cancer cells, which means that your cancer lives off your hormones, you might be lucky enough they can give you a tablet, which I went on for 4 years and 10 months, that will cut off the supply of what they feed themselves on, these little cells. And so what's the difference between overcoming things as a primary cancer person, with chemo? It was worth the 3 months of heavy chemo that really had times that, it was really, really challenging. But it was worth it because I then got 4 years and 10 months. Usually they think after you hit the 5-year mark, it's like, lucky you're in the 70% of breast cancer patients who are probably unlikely to get your cancer back. So I ended up in the 30% that was not so lucky. The little stray cancer cells out there that had, most of them had obviously would have been knocked out by chemo, but a few would have been left, and those little few hung around for 4 years and 10 months, mutating, changing, and saying, we don't care about your estrogen anymore. We've found somewhere else to live. We're having a party. We're over in your liver. And by the time we found all this, there was innumerable tumours, which meant more than you can count. And they were up to 3 centimetres. So it kind of looked like a really bad kind of, I don't know, like leprosy. When I saw the ultrasound, it was really scary. It's just, whoa, all these lumps in the liver. Whoa. It looked pretty bad. And my liver function was really bad. So I couldn't at that time eat very much. I was on liquid food, down to a quarter of my intake. I couldn't do liquids, do water until I was going to bed, because I could only get a certain amount per day and I had to do food. So I had to wake up and do drink, and it was very, very hard to breathe, and one half of my diaphragm was not moving because the liver was so enlarged. And I had an incredibly dry mouth. It would wake me up all the time because I couldn't make saliva. And had this terrible taste all the time, like a tinny taste, which was because my ferritin was 1,000 times the high level because I couldn't get rid of it. So anyway, that was my situation. And I was told straight away by the GP and the oncologist, what you have now is an incurable situation. And I was like, okay, so this is it. Okay, what do you have to offer me? And of course, because it no longer responded to hormones, what I was offered was chemo. And I got chemo 2 days later. So they put in a PICC line, so I didn't have to wait to see if my veins would work. And we didn't have to wait for an op to put in a port. We just, they threaded this through to an artery over here, and I have an open vein thing where I get all my drugs. And I go in on a weekly basis. So I had chemo yesterday. So what does chemo, what can, even people with metastatic cancer can be really sick from their chemo. But some are not, because the dose and the type of drugs is different, and they're not giving you an absolute heaviest possible hitting of drugs at this point, because they know they can't cure this. So they're balancing this with quality of life, because you might, for example, if you had metastases to bone, many of those people can live, 5 years, some live 10, some live 15, some have lived 20. Depends on how slowly developing this is, because the bone does not get a lot of nutrition. But in other places like the liver, it gets wonderful nutrition, lots of blood. So, you might not, I think the general thing is kind of like 1 to 3 years. And everybody's different depending on how late they find to these things and how much have tumors taken over your liver. And how well are you responding to the drugs, and what's your immunity like? Like, do you have enough immunity to get full chemo regularly, all that stuff? So, yes, some of us who have metastatic and are doing chemo, we look pretty good, or we might look pretty good. And certainly when you first start, like I was in really ill state, so I found chemo a lot harder the first time, but as it's gone on and we've shrunk the tumours in the liver enough for me to eat properly and breathe properly, and I can make saliva, I don't have the terrible taste, all that stuff, and that sounds great. You can say, wow, she's cured. No, I'm not cured. Ultimately these cells will mutate and this drug will no longer be effective, and then all the tumours will keep doing what they do, which is grow and spread and seed themselves and go further. They might go to my lungs, they might go to my brain. I've already got one in my spine. They can spread further out to other organs, and everyone has a different journey, and that nobody knows how fast or slow that spread may be, etc. So and then they might try another drug, and about 30% of people will respond to this, what's called a second line chemo, and 70% won't. And if you're in the 30%, you might get lucky. When I say lucky, they'll extend your life for a further amount of time, for as long as that one works, and they may work shorter and shorter as you go along. Anyway, some people are, they get a lot more years, so we get a few more months, and it's just a different world. I don't find it horrifying or terrifying. Everybody's different. Other people do find it, much harder to adjust to. So then there's this idea of, if only you did fruit juice, if only you did, miso soup, if only you, took this particular supplement, etc., etc., etc. Cannabis oil, you need to stop everything. And I studied every single one of these by looking at Google Scholar and finding if there were any studies. And there's been studies on pretty much all and any of these things, and they're all documented. If you go to, Wikipedia and you look at alternative cancer treatments, there's a lot of literature that talks about studies, and basically none have checked out. So this is why can't something like some fruit juice and miso soup or a bit of cannabis oil stop large tumours which have great vein systems from feeding themselves? Well, it's like this. If you want to go and kill something on the head of a pin and you hit it with something so heavy, that it really leaves you with chemo brain and edema and autonomic dysfunction and incredible impact, and still some of these buggers survive, for you, as the one who ended up in the 30% that got the cancer back. And I was the person who drank dandelion coffee every day. And I was the fruit juice woman. And I was the really healthy eating person. And I didn't smoke and I didn't drink alcohol. And really like low toxic kind of lifestyle. The ideal lifestyle that I shouldn't have got cancer. But I am from a cancer family. And I have genetic issues and immune issues. And so I was like the horse in the race that you were going to bet on was probably going to get their stuff back. And it's okay. It is what it is. And I am what I am. But, you know, if that level of stuff can't knock out every single cancer cell at that point when it's even microscopic, how do you expect it's going to knock out something the equivalent of a 100-foot gum tree that is a large tumor? And some people have tumors bigger than 3 centimeters. They got like big old 10 centimeter, 15 centimeter tumors. No, not going to happen. Oh, but I read about somebody, I ran across someone in a supermarket and their doctor said their only hope was chemo, and they went home and they took fruit juice and cannabis oil and they got cancer free. And I saw on the internet this person who was stage 4. Well, I've gone and looked up all the names that I can find of these people. And if you actually look at, into the Quack Watch stuff about them, I mean, one of these people was diagnosed by their chiropractor and a naturopath. They did no actual biopsies. They did no testing other than naturopath testing, chiropractic testing, but there was no cancer specialist on board, and yet they were convinced they had late stage cancer, that they had cured themselves by going down their alternative route. But there was no confirmed. And when I say confirmed, I mean you don't go to a hat shop and ask them about shoes, unless they sell shoes. You don't go to a chiropractor or a naturopath who is not a cancer specialist and can do none of the testing specific to staging cancer, and presume that their diagnosis is accurate. And therefore you shouldn't be able to go and do big financials of selling all your books and going on all your lectures because you know how to cure, stage 4 cancer. There was another one who was everywhere on the internet, and this person said that they had cured themselves with cannabis oil and they'd never had chemo. Well, actually, they had 8 years of chemo, and they had theirs in their bone, which is slow developing, and people with that can live, as I said, 5, 10, 15 or more years. This person's lived 10 years. This is fairly usual with metastases to the bone. Not necessarily usual, but it's not unheard of. And yet, the sensationalism is they did it all with cannabis oil. And cannabis oil has been shown, to help people with epilepsy, or some people pain relief in things like MS. It might help people sleep. It might help with their mood, but it has not been shown to treat metastatic cancer. And there are many things that are found to kill a cancer cell in a petri dish, a little dish, some little cells, little microscopic cells. But when you have metastatic cancer, you have tumours with vein systems feeding themselves off your body. This is not a microscopic cell in a little sterile petri dish. There's a world of difference. So scaring the crap out of cancer patients by saying, chemo kills, you wouldn't have got your cancer back if you didn't do chemo originally. That's what's brought it back. Really, that's so, just go and talk to somebody who is actually an oncologist, someone who that's their speciality, that's their field. Yes, if you want to go and live in your conspiracy theories, you see they're all getting heaps of money, pharmaceutical industry. I mean, if you're actually in this system and you see the level of care and passion that these people put into trying to save and prolong quality of life for their patients, that is such an insult. That is so ignorant. That is such an outside of you. And I'm really lucky because when I went into my chemo this time round as a metastatic cancer patient, I would have had about another 2 months to live. Instead, I'm on a cancer chemo drug that I take on a weekly basis if I have enough immunity. And at the moment, it's 2 weeks on, 1 week off, because I don't have enough immunity to do 3 weeks on, 1 week off. And I made it part of my life, my usual life. We call it my job. And this will extend that 2 months I would have had with no treatment into what will be about 8 to 12 months until this is no longer effective. And then the next one may not work for me. That might be my lot. But the difference between 2 months in a serious condition and you're gone, and the quality of life I have now, yeah, I got no hair, whoopee-doo. Yeah, I have to go and get blood work on a Monday and I do chemo on a Tuesday, whoopee-doo. But the rest of the time I get to pat my cats, I get to snuggle with my man, I get to finish up all the things I want to finish up, all the projects and passions, and, you know, throw my own living wake, do some writing, do some music, do some art, yeah, connect with my closest friends, get rid of all my paperwork, give away all the clutter, so that I move from my permanent residency status into my temporary residency status into my tourist status before my deportation, where I will be leaving the body. And when I leave the body, my body will not be able to run my thoughts and my feelings and my experiences, but they live on in all the people and everything that I've invested in that I leave behind. It's a garden that I propagated and grow, all my creativity that's traveled around the world, all the people I have loved, and my closest. Yeah, so I live on there. So I hope that's a little bit grounding for outsiders about what is chemo from those, you know, different sides of things, and what it, you know, when is chemo required. And I guess at the end also there's a time when chemo stops working, or where you just have had enough. You know, you might be in a reasonable state when you first start palliative chemo that improves the quality of your life and perhaps extends it. And by the end you might be in a state that you really just want to go more quickly. And that's also a choice, to end what sustains you, because the quantity is not worth it, because it's too much of a cost in quality. And I guess that's the last part of the chemo journey. Yeah. So hopefully that's humanized it. Bye.